Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about culturally responsive assessments. So let's get started. So we have some focuses for today. We are going to talk about assessment, what's an evaluation, how are they similar and different, what are some culturally responsive and relevant assessments, and then how can we measure and promote well-being of our students, and how does leadership influence student learning? So first off, what is an assessment? So we use assessments to identify individual student weaknesses and strengths, to then provide support for our students, maybe different programs or social services. All classroom assessments that we do use provide feedback on the effectiveness of our instruction, and they also give students a measure of their progress of learning. So two major classroom assessment functions: to show if learning has been successful or not, and then to clarify expectations of the teachers from the students. So why are assessments important? Well, they drive our instruction. They drive our student learning. It is an integral, just a big part of instruction, as it determines whether or not the goals of education are being met. They make decisions about grades, placement, instructional needs, curriculum, and sometimes funding. There are 5 types of assessments, and I'm going to talk just briefly on each of those, but some big hard questions to ask us through assessment: are we teaching what we think we are teaching? Are students learning what they're supposed to learn? And is there a way to teach the subject better, therefore promoting better learning? So let's take a look at these 5 types. First, we have formative and summative. Formative is through the learning process that we, as teachers, give feedback to the learner to help them with their strengths and their weaknesses for future work. A summative assessment is used to make decisions for grading. It does occur at the end, and it's used more in a judging way of the learner's overall performance. Then we have informal and formal. Informal judgments are during a task. We integrate those. So we use that to provide formative feedback. Sometimes it could have bias or high subjectivity, could be. Formal assessment is, sometimes there could be stress or a greater motivation for students to do the formal assessment. Students know that the task is at hand, is used for assessment purposes. It's just more not informal throughout the everyday, like in our classroom. We do have continuous versus final. Continuous occurs throughout the learning process, used for the instructor's knowledge of progress, provides teacher and students information needed to improve teaching and learning. Final, just like what it sounds, it takes place at the end, used for summative decision making. We have process and product. Process focuses on the steps of the procedure for a particular task. Product, it is more the evaluation of the result of the outcome of the process. That makes sense, hopefully. Then we have divergent and convergent. Divergent assessment is used, there's a wide range of answers or solutions that are possible, more authentic. It does take longer to grade, just to evaluate that, whereas convergent, one correct response, it's easy to score. This is a page I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I would print this out for you to know if your assessment is working best. It should do the following. So it should provide diagnostic feedback. Here's some questions for you to make sure that's happening. It should help educators set standards. Again, use those questions to make sure that's happening. Evaluate progress. Here's some questions you could ask yourself for that. Relates to student progress. So here again, some questions you could be asking to make sure it does relate to student progress. And then the last helpful tip for us to make sure assessments are working, that they motivate performance for student self-evaluation and also for teacher self-evaluation. So in black, those are the questions. In white, those are just the ways that we know the assessment is working. And then let's get to evaluation. So evaluation, it is determining the value of something. So it means that we're measuring or observing the process to judge or determine its value by comparing it to others or some kind of standard. That evaluations, we focus more on grades for that, more of the final process. We're comparing students' achievement with other students' achievement. And then here are 5 basic components for evaluation. I'm going to let you read those and then we can go to the next slide. So if you're confused on the differences between assessment and evaluation, I would definitely pause the video and read over just the comparison chart. Here's assessment on the right, and then left, and then evaluation on the right. It just breaks it up more kind of like by the meaning, the nature of the assessments or evaluation, what it does, the purpose, a good chart to kind of come back to if you need it. So we have student assessments. So what are some student assessments? What are some methods? I'm going to focus on formative assessment, the process. The purpose is to evaluate student learning over time. Summative, the purpose is to produce a measure that sums up student learning, kind of like a final exam. So methods of student assessment. You could use a self-assessment where the students are making a personal judgment. You could use peer assessment where they're evaluating the work of peers and then the peers do evaluate their own work too. We have essays. Another assessment piece is an exam. The key I want you to just remember here in the bottom paragraph is assessment is more than just grading. So it links us to student performance and to specific learning objectives to make sure that we are getting the information we need and showing student achievement. Also, some things with assessment, we want to make sure our assessment is allowing our students to think critically. So we want our students to be able to explain themselves and what they know to show their learning. We don't want students to just, on assessment, we don't want them to just repeat the information or only answer questions on the assessment. We want them to be critical thinkers. So here's a great book, Critical Thinking Tools for Taking Charge of Your Learning, of Your Life, and then some ways that you could add these critical thinking points in your classroom. Really, critical thinkers seek to improve thinking. They analyze thinking, they assess thinking, and then make sure whatever you're using, it's requiring your students to think critically. Let's move into culturally relative assessments. This was probably my favorite article, and I have linked it. You can just click on it. So, ways to change the conversation about assessment. So, working toward culturally responsive assessment practices. I love what he said. Valentin Gibson said that we understand the importance of getting to know our students. When we're talking about assessment, you have to know your students. We agree that we cannot create a curriculum that meets their needs, much less their cultural needs, if we don't know them as human beings. And also, he said, I wasn't able to effectively help them, his students, and his classroom until I understood them as people and understood their culture. Okay, so really focusing on them as people first and not just focusing on assessments. I couldn't help but just give you this. Again, this was my favorite article. What is culturally relevant response teaching, and how do we become responsive teachers? He just kind of shared his journey of changing to become a culturally responsive teacher. He talked a lot about definitely getting to know your students, collaborating with teachers and parents to just learn about the cultural literacy practices for their students and their community. So making sure that that culturally relevant assessments, you have to kind of question yourself as a teacher. How are you using those assessments? Are they showing student learning and respecting their culture? And then he talked about assessment methods to show student learning. And he first talked about just using a rubric. One common tool is a rubric, and using a rubric to kind of start a conversation with parents to figure out what is their home language. And then using that to kind of see the student home perspective, because that's a part of their culture, and how they present, that is a part of their culture. So yeah, this was just awesome. I would read through this, and then even focusing on tools of written conversation for assessment, they can write in their first language. We don't have to change our students, but allow that assessment to really show who the students are, and that we just get to be a part of it. It's just an awesome opportunity to be actively engaged in them as people and their culture. One article even mentioned performance assessments. So a great way to bring forth their culturally relevant is through performance assessments. So she mentioned making an assessment culturally responsive in diverse contexts means allowing students to draw connections between their learning and their direct daily experience with the world, and treating those experiences as an asset into our classroom. Two key lessons that I did take away from that article was putting relationships at the center and providing the space for students to share their stories. So making performance assessments allows them to just share who they are and their experiences. And then another key lesson is using students' personal experiences to drive civic and community engagement. So having them connect with the community, and even having their assessment have a piece of it be connecting to the community. Here's one thing I would read through just for you personally, as we want to have classroom cultures that are centered on our students and recognize their personal experiences, just fostering a sense of cultural belonging among our students. Because it is the whole child with education. So that's social, emotional, academic learning. It's a great thing that we can learn as teachers. Student well-being. So, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Let me get back to that. So student well-being. Focus on a positive sense of self, spirit, and belonging that we can feel when we are cognitive, emotional, social, and physical needs are being met. It is supported through equity and respect of our diverse identities and strengths. So a student's well-being is not just academics, and we may not be able to test that in our classrooms. There's a big part of that that is just the cognitive, emotional, social, physical needs that are kind of that we see outside of our classrooms as well. But some factors that we could promote well-being: positive relationships with teachers, having a classroom of feeling just belonging. Students need that structure of behavior management. Also, student perceptions of testing. Kind of a lot of students may get stressed about testing, so kind of talking to them about that. The impact of negative teacher-student relationships does factor up to their well-being. Parent involvement, of course, schools and parents in partnership, so working together. Bullying, that's a factor of well-being. And then involving the whole school community for the bullying program. So those are some factors that we can work on as a school of just promoting our well-being. And then lastly, leadership impacts student learning, of course. At the core of the most definitions of leadership are two functions: providing direction and exercising influence. So here are some things that I'm not going to read over, but we know that school leaders are outside of our classroom, but they impact student learning so much. They impact the people that are allowing learning to happen. So here's the last slide that I'm going to end on, and just you start with the state leadership, heads down to district leadership, student family background, school leadership. So this is just a good framework to show that leaders play critical roles in identifying and supporting learning, structuring the social setting, and meditating the external demands. So student learning is all it's all impacted by these pieces. And then here are just my references. So I hope that you learned a lot about just assessments and evaluations and what we can do as teachers to improve and make sure that all of our students are being connected.